everybody. This is Tim from Seagate Wines. Today we are going to talk about that great, wonderful, amazing wine experience that is sparkling wines. So sparkling wine itself is pretty much any wine that has significant levels of carbon dioxide in it, making it fizzy. Now there are dozens and dozens, and if not hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of wines that are sparkling, some that are fully sparkling, some that are frizzante or effervescent as they were. But all of these wines basically have the same thing in common in that you have carbon dioxide present inside the wine. So it's no longer a still wine. Traditionally, when people say sparkling wine, I mean, they always tend to go to champagne. Real champagne must come from the Champagne region of France by law. It is illegal to call your wine champagne, at least in the EU, if you are not from the Champagne region. The rest are just sparkling wines. And there are various different versions of sparkling wines. For example, everyone knows very popular these days would be Prosecco from Italy, but there's also, super popular, super famous would be Cava from the Catalonia region of Spain. And then from around the rest of the world, things like Spumante, which is basically the Italian term for anything that sparkles, would be Spumante. And you have Spumante would come from different regions, like Asti, the city of Asti, for example, very, very famous Asti Spumante. But there are also different sparkling wines from other parts of the world, especially in France. There are lots. Things like Crémant, so the Crémant de Bourgogne, for example, very famous, or the Blanquette de Lemieux from the southern part of France. They're all very famous sparkling wine areas. They do have sparkling wine now pretty much in every winemaking country in the world. But it all comes down to the differences are both in the soil where they come from, but also in the way that they're made. So a little history for you. The idea of sparkling wine for the longest time was actually considered to be a fault. It was something that was wrong with the wine. Effervescence has been observed in these wines throughout history. I mean, that was written in texts from ancient Greece and from the Romans, but the cause of the mysterious bubbles was not necessarily understood. So in the ancient past, it was attributed to phases of the moon or good and evil spirits, as we tend to lean on things like that when we don't understand what's going on. The tendency of still wine from the Champagne region specifically to lightly sparkle had been written since the Middle Ages, but it was considered a fault and it was not really enjoyed by people in early Champagne winemaking, although it made the pride of other historic sparkling wine production areas like Lemieux, for example. Now, Dom Perignon, who was a monk, he was originally charged by his superiors at the Abbey of Hautevillers to get rid of the bubbles, since the pressure in the bubbles tend to make them blow up the bottles. So they didn't have a strong enough glass to actually keep the bubbles inside the bottle. Later on, when they deliberately started sparkling wine production in the 18th century, cellar workers would still have to wear heavy iron masks that kind of look like a catcher's mitt, or a catcher's mask from the 70s and 80s baseball players. In order to prevent themselves from getting hurt from spontaneously blowing up bottles. The disturbance caused by one's bottle disintegration could cause a chain reaction, and it was quite routine in cellars to lose anywhere from 20 to 90% of their bottle production to instability. It's crazy when you think about that. So the British were actually the first to see the tendency of wines from Champagne to sparkle as a desirable trait. And try to understand where the bubbles were coming from. So they were often transported wines from France into England in wooden wine barrels, where merchants would then put them into a bottle themselves for sale. And during the 17th century, the glass production in England used coal-fueled ovens, and so it made the glass hotter, so it produced stronger, more durable glass bottles than the wood-fired French glass that were prone to exploding. So the English actually learned to really keep the bubbles inside the bottle. So a little that's your little history lesson for it. There are so many different styles of sparkling wines. Let's have a quick look at these ones here. So fully sparkling wines, like champagne, for example, they're sold with anywhere from 5 to 6 atmospheres of pressure inside the bottle. It's nearly twice the pressure found in an automobile tire. So EU regulations define a sparkling wine as any wine with excess of 3 atmospheres in pressure. So in that group you'd have Sekt from Germany, and I guess in Austria they're also calling it Sekt as well, S-E-K-T. Spanish Espumoso, Italian Spumante, French Cremant, and the Mousseux wines. There's also 70 sparkling wines defined between 1 and 2.5 atmospheres of pressure, and those would be in German and Austrian, that would be called Spritzig. And then we have Frizzante in Italian, and also in Spanish as well, they have Frizzante. And the French would be Pétillant. Pétillant. The amount of pressure in the wine is determined by the amount of sugar that you add during the tirage stage at the beginning of their secondary fermentation. We'll talk about secondary fermentation in a minute. And the more sugar will produce more carbon dioxide, obviously, because we know that yeast eats sugar and produces carbon dioxide as in the basic fermentation methods of making wine. There are also red sparkling wines. Usually it would be done in a rosé wine, for example, but there are actual red sparkling wines. The most famous of that would probably be Lambrusco from Italy, and Brachetto, also from Italy. Those very popular, kind of fizzy, interesting, sweeter, not necessarily sweet, but very fruity wines from that area of Italy. But they're also, in Italy, they're also doing things like sparkling Barbera and things like that. But you can also find in Australia, sparkling Shiraz is very popular. People are just basically seeing how far that they can go with all of these things. Now, when you're making wine, basically all these wines, all sparkling wines, start out as a still wine. So we've already discussed in the intro to wine video, if you want to go back and review the intro to wine video, we've talked about how you make wine and the process of fermentation. So we don't need to go back into that again, but what we will do is we'll talk about the difference between still wine and this, and that would be the secondary fermentation. So there are several different methods that are used to carry out secondary fermentation, and the most well-known and the best quality, the highest quality, would be the traditional method, method traditionnelle, or the champagne method, method champenoise. That is basically where you're going to get the best quality sparkling wine, is in that method. So you start with a base cuvée, which is your base still wine, and then it's bottled with a mixture of sugar and yeast into the bottle that you're going to drink it from. A fresh yeast in a little food source basically triggers the secondary fermentation process, and that will inside the bottle that it will be sold in. And that is the key part, is that it is in the same bottle that you're going to drink it from. And then every day for, depending on the wine, can be anywhere from a year, 18 months, to as many as 5 years or longer. They have to go through a process called riddling. And in Champagne, they still do this traditionally. One person or a series of people will turn with their hands, basically they will turn each bottle up to 1 million bottles, and they will do that 1/4 turn every single day. So usually some of the smaller houses, there'd be one person doing this, and he will do upwards of 100 to 200,000 bottles in a day. And then the larger houses will have a team of people in the cellar, their cellar team, that will do the riddling up to 1 million plus bottles a day. Now, Other champagne method, traditional method wines that where you're fermenting in the bottle, for example, both of these two, this is a Cava from the Catalunya Penedès region, and this one here is from the Rueda region of Spain. This is made with 100% Verdejo, so it just qualifies under the sparkling wine category. It's neither Cava nor Champagne, but it is made in the Champagne method, where this bottle is the bottle where secondary fermentation happens. Now, these two Spanish styles, along with many other of the New World wine making areas, do not do the hand riddling inside of the pupitre. Because of the time consumption, the amount of labor cost that goes into it, which is why champagne is so much more expensive than other sparkling wines, is that everything is done by hand. There's a lot of labor involved. These ones will be put inside of a large crate, a metal crate that will hold hundreds of bottles at a time. And then the crate goes on to this machine called the gyropalette. And the gyropalette will turn the entire crate a small turn every day. So you get the same effect of having all of the sediment and things settle to the neck of the bottle. So inside the pupitre, the bottle will sit in this fashion, and then all of the sediment from the fermentation process will settle down into the base of the neck. And then from this point, after the wine is ready, they do what's called dégorgement, where they will take the neck of the bottle, and they will quickly freeze the neck of the bottle in nitrogen, and they open the bottle, and the pressure that's built up will pop this little cork of frozen sediment out. They take that out, they recork the bottle, and then they cap it for sale with all of the dressing and stuff on it. At that point, when they do the dégorgement, there's something that many wines do, which is called dosage. So they're adding a mixture of fresh wine and sugar syrup just to balance the wine and depending on what style you like. Now, we also, aside from the wines that I have here right now, in our portfolio, Drapier makes something that's called Brut Nature. So it's basically natural. They do not add any dosage in both a rosé and a brut form. Those wines have no dosage at all. They leave them as they are right from the dégorgement. So after that point, what you're left with is what's in the bottle. And sometimes these bottles will then sit inside the cellars of the wineries for another year to 2 years before they're released to the public, some even longer. For example, the Grand Cru stuff that is coming out right now, a lot of the winemakers, I know Drapier, for example, we distribute Drapier and Lallier, and both of those companies are now releasing this year 2012. So 8 years from the vintage pick to bottle release for their Grand Cru stuff, their really, really high-end stuff. That's a long time. There's a lot of work that goes involved. So the second way of making this, there's a few of them actually. The second way would be what, like Prosecco, for example. So Prosecco uses basically the similar thing, but it's called the tank transfer method. And the tank transfer method, after the wines have gone through the traditional method, basically including the riddling and the dégorgement, bottles are then emptied into a large tank. All right, and then the large tank, then they can control the amount of everything that's going on. They balance the wine in the tank, and then it goes back into bottles, not in the same bottle, but in a new bottle. So Prosecco is slightly different. It's still a natural bubble, but it is not going to have as well integrated a bubble as you're going to have from the traditional method. And then the Charmat method, which is the last one, it takes place in stainless steel. So they have fermentation tanks made completely out of stainless steel that are highly pressurized, and then they add a fresh yeast and sugar mixture to still wine that creates a fermentation again, and then when it's cooled, they clarify it, and then they use a counter pressure system that helps to fill the bottles without problems, and then they inject carbon dioxide. So the same kind of thing, it's basically carbonation, the same as in soda. So wines using the Charmat method would be using something the same as your soda would be. It's very, basically the cheapest of all the sparkling wines are using that method because the bubbles are quite large and they dissipate very quickly. They're not integrated into the wine and really not that good to begin with. So when we talk about the bubbles themselves, the initial burst of effervescence occurs when the sparkling wine gets a dry glass. As soon as you hit the dry glass, the bubbles form on the little imperfections that are inside the glass that facilitate nucleation. Okay? Nucleations are needed to stimulate the formation of bubbles because carbon dioxide has to first diffuse from the wine solution before it can rise out of the glass and then into the air. Okay? So when you pour a glass of sparkling wine, it's going to lose its bubbliness and carbon dioxide gas much more quickly than the open bottle will by itself. So because of the larger space, the larger opening, it's been in contact with perfections, releasing more gas, and that's how you're going to lose your bubbles fairly quickly. The frothiness, we call that the mousse that's on the top, along with the average size and consistencies of the bubbles, is going to vary depending on the quality of the wine and the type of the glass used. So we're going to talk about glass in a second, but really important to me is about the quality of the bubbles. So consistency, so you want even spaced bubbles, and they should be very, very fine. The smaller, the finer the bubble, the more creamy the mouthfeel, the more rich the texture of the wine is going to be in your mouth. Here's a little fact for you. The average bottle of champagne contains enough carbon dioxide to produce 49 million bubbles. Pretty interesting. So let's talk about the different grades of sparkling. There are, obviously, you've probably seen them on the labels, and you kind of, well, what does that mean? So there is Brut. The driest would be Brut Natural, which is, or Brut Zero. Sometimes they call it in things like Australia, South America, South Africa, places that are making, or even U.S. Making sparkling wines, but trying to distance themselves a little bit from the French. So Brut Zero would be 0 grams of sugar added. Okay, and it will contain less than 3 grams of sugar per liter in the wine itself, and that would be residual sugar from the original wine. Extra Brut would be fewer than 6 grams of sugar per liter, and then Brut is less than 12 grams per liter. So some of the Brut wines will actually have a dosage that are emptied back into the bottle before it is capped. So let's talk about the different wines. Champagne, specifically, as the most famous and probably the highest quality, has to come from the Champagne region, as we've already discussed, and it is 8% of worldwide sparkling wine production, in many other regions emulating the style in both the grapes and the production methods. Now, the grapes for Champagne are almost always, there are some changes in certain production houses, but it's almost always Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. Those are the traditional wines, grapes, not wines, the grapes of Champagne. Now, another funny thing, the Drapier family is actually, in the 50s, they were the first wine house in Champagne to grow Pinot Noir, and they were kind of laughed at for doing it, and now it is a standard. So people who break ground sometimes are the ones that you want to follow. So some of the other grapes that you can use, I mean, basically nowadays they're making sparkling wine out of pretty much anything, but classics for Cava would be Parellada, Xarel·lo, and Macabeo. Those are the 3 grape varieties that are in Cava. And they are making Cava that have some Chardonnay in them as well, and some Pinot Noir mixed into them as well. There are Cavas that are rosé, and that tends to be a Pinot Noir mix, or a Tempranillo or Garnacha in Spain, mixed in to give it a little bit of that color. Let's talk about some of the other things too. So Crémant, you'll see this in a lot of really good wine shops. Cremant is basically the same wine that's coming from Champagne, but it's not inside the Champagne region. So they'll also be allowed to use some different grapes as well. So they tend to use things like Chardonnay, obviously, would be the biggest one, but also Chenin Blanc. You can see Cabernet Franc in their rosés or sparkling red styles. They are allowed to use in some of these other appellations grapes like Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Gamay, Pinot de Nuit, and Gruyot. These are all French grapes, so they're allowed to use some of these things. In Burgundy, the Crémant de Bourgogne, for example, uses Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, and Pinot Gris. Aligote is actually used a lot as well as a blending grape to help round out these flavors in some of these. So these are all different, they're different grape varieties that you're going to find, and you can literally find almost any grape in the world right now as being made into a sparkling style. I want to talk about some of the other things that people don't really understand about these things. Let me grab this guy here, and we're open this up. So, a bottle of champagne, on the bottom, you always have this very deep area where your thumb should go for pour. All right, this is called the punt. Okay, and that is that's basically to try and keep your hands off the bottle itself, so you don't raise the temperature and keep it nice and cold. So when you're opening a bottle of champagne, most important thing: always do not point it at anyone else. So you're going to want to take the foil off, all right? So on the back, you'll see the cage, and the cage wrap here is exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, every single time. Doesn't matter what bottle you pick, doesn't matter where it's from, that the cap cage will always be 6 turns, okay? Now when you're opening the bottle, you want to hold it firmly at both ends, especially the cork, and turn the bottle, not the cork, okay? Now once you've loosened the cork, the pressure should just let it come out. You do not want it to pop. You don't want it to go too crazy, because you don't want to lose all the bubbles, okay? So when it shoots across the room and starts to foam out all over the place, you've basically lost all of that, all of the bubbles that you've worked so hard to get into the bottle. Especially with champagne, you've spent a lot of money to get them. So when we're talking about glass, okay, you've seen things like the coupe. It's a big open shallow that you used to see in a lot of the old movies and things like that, like on the Titanic, and first class would be served in these big, huge, giant bowls. Well, the bowls basically, they are really wide open, so you don't really get any of the beauty of the champagne. You don't get any of the aromas, any of the the nuances that have gone into the champagne. And then the opposite style, nowadays everybody tries to use the flute glass, and I don't like the flute glass either, because the flute glass is not large enough for your nose to get into it. Now, one thing the flute glass does is it lets the bubbles in the wine stay in the wine a lot longer. But for me, the best glasses, there are a couple of them, but Riedel makes a lovely glass. They actually have a champagne specific glass, and it's wonderful for sparkling wines. But also for me, this is my #1 glass for pretty much anything. This is called the Gabriel glass, and it, as you can see, it has the large bowl at the bottom where it's going to allow all of the flavors and all of the aromas and the bouquet to really build, and then the glass really narrows to the top and drives all of those flavors and smells and aromas, everything right into your nose. So when you're pouring, we're tilting the glass, and you can see how you're getting these little creamy mousse across the top. That's as it touches the glass. And then it goes away, and you're left with this beautiful steady stream of small bubbles. Now, we're not going to pour too much in the glass, because you want to really understand the wine and really get into the wine. So we let the wine open up a little bit. And in this glass, you can really get inside the glass to really enjoy the wine. Cheers. Wow, fantastic. So next time you guys are looking for a bottle of sparkles, understand that, you know, for special occasions and obviously if your budget allows, always go to the best wines you can. So obviously Jappier in both the Brut version and the beautiful rosé version are spectacular wines, but for everyday drinking, and honestly, I love drinking sparkling regardless of the time. It doesn't need a celebration other than the fact that you made it through another day. And for that, you can't beat the price of something like the Brut Verdejo, or if you want to be a little more traditional, then the Cava from Paco and Lola, the Lola Cava, which is again really, really beautiful. It's not as I find that the Borno sparkling is a little more floral, obviously because of the Verdejo grape. It's gorgeous stuff. But for the price, you can't beat these two wines in that style. If you're a Prosecco person, maybe give something in the traditional method a shot, because you may find that you actually like it even better because the bubbles are just so much more fine. So I hope you learned a little something about sparkling wines, and I hope to see you again really soon. Remember, leave us a message at the end if you guys want to learn something else about wine. If there's something specific you want me to talk about, I'll happily talk to you about it. And if you have any more questions, shoot us a message, and we're always there to help. So happy drinking, everybody. Cheers.